was going to say, I'm convinced by you, I'm convinced by Sylvain. This is a big damn deal.
Welcome to Canusa Street, a podcast at the intersection of the issues and policies between Canada and the United States. Here are your hosts, Scotty Greenwood and Chris Sands.
Welcome back to Canusa Street, everybody. We are excited to have you back. I'm Scotty Greenwood with the Canadian American Business Council, and I am joined with the ever fabulous Chris Sands. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Scotty. Glad to be back.
Glad to be back together, get the band back together. We are going to talk today about a very interesting issue. We've talked about it before, and we're going to continue the conversation with a Canadian perspective. We like to have a U.S. perspective, a Canadian perspective on all these issues. It's the Columbia River Treaty, and we've got a very special and very insightful guest to talk with us today. And Chris, why don't I turn it over to you to both introduce our distinguished diplomat and also to introduce the issue?
Sure. Well, fantastic. Thank you, Scotty. So our guest today is Canada's Consul General in Denver, Sylvain Fabi. And Sylvain is somebody who those of us who follow Canada-US relations know, because for a time he was running the North American policy shop within Global Affairs Canada. He has been a departmental advisor for the Minister of International Trade. We always have these trade issues going back and forth. Has a very distinguished career as a professional Canadian diplomat. But where it really comes together is in the negotiation of the Columbia River Treaty. Now, the treaty has been around for a long time, but gets renewed periodically. And we're in the middle of a negotiation, as some of our previous episodes had covered, on a new distribution. And some of it is about the water that flows, some of it is about the electricity that is generated, and some of it is about the ecosystem, the fish, the wildlife, and how our shared management of this waterway, which goes back to the 1950s, can be amended for a new century. And these are not easy talks. We've had some great discussions here, but now I think to get a Canadian perspective on just why this is so important and why we haven't finished resolving it yet.
That's exactly right, Chris. So welcome, Mr. Consul General. Maybe you could start us off by giving us just a little bit of what is the Columbia River Treaty? Like, what's it all about, briefly? And then what's your point of view on where it is? We'd love to hear from you on that.
Yes, thank you, both of you, for this very kind introduction. I'm always surprised when people say things like that they're actually talking about me, but I appreciate that. The Columbia River Treaty was negotiated in the early 1960s for two reasons at the time. The first one was due to the fact that too often, especially on the U.S. side, we saw flooding, some of it catastrophic, due to the snow melting in the spring and rushing down the Columbia River, right? So one of the first reasons to try to find solutions between Canada and the U.S. was to minimize the risk of flooding happening due to the snow melting and the water rushing down. The other reason to do that is the Columbia River is a magnificent river for many, many, many reasons, but one of them is hydroelectric production capacity, right? So, but in order to be able to maximize the production of electricity, you need certain conditions. And Canada and the US entered into a negotiation not only to avoid flooding happening in the US, but also to try to maximize hydroelectricity production in the US. So these were the two pillars of the treaty. And despite the fact that both in Canada and in the US, a lot of things are being done regarding ecosystems, unfortunately, the treaty did not contemplate the environment and the ecosystems when it was negotiated in the 60s. And also, you won't be surprised to hear that First Nations, or as you call them in the United States, tribes, were not involved, were not consulted, did not have to say much, despite the fact that they were quite severely affected by the implementation of the treaty, right? So the treaty now has been running for 60 years. The treaty itself, almost 60 years. The treaty itself does not end unless one of the two signatories decides to cancel the treaty, to terminate the treaty, right? However, one part of the treaty in 2024 will come to an end. What is this? It's a flood risk management system that was negotiated by Canada and the US. It was a more predictable flood risk management regime that was negotiated that would last for 60 years until 2024. And the US paid at the time $64 million to Canada for the right to occupy space behind our dams, fill up and down our reservoirs in order to minimize the risk of flooding in the US. So that part, that what we call assured flood control management, comes to an end in 2024. Now the treaty has a provision that will allow the US to receive some flood risk protection from the management of the dams in Canada, but in a lot less predictable, more ad hoc manner. That's not good. It's not good for the US. It's not something that would really be optimal for Canada either. So that's where we are. We are renegotiating, negotiating to modernize the treaty in order to have a treaty that is a little bit more modern, takes into consideration, the evolution of things, climate science, inclusion of Indigenous nations in the process of this whole management.
Sylvain, that's a very good framing of it. It strikes me that this is what makes this a unique setting. Obviously, we have the Niagara Falls dams, which were generating shared electricity for a long time on the Great Lakes St. Lawrence system. But there, we haven't had the issues of flooding. It's mostly about, power, and we actually have different parts of the falls that we're damming. And then if you go a little bit further west, we famously have the Red River that connects up to Winnipeg and beyond. There is regular flooding there, and that's been an issue in recent years. But the river itself is not a big hydro river. It's more farther up that Manitoba Hydro operates. So you see here something which is unique in the combination of these things in one big treaty, pulling it all together. You mentioned, though, and this is where I wanted to pick up, you mentioned the new players, and this is something that I think both countries have been slow to deal with. With the Pacific Salmon Treaty in the 1990s, there was discussion of First Nations rights, Indigenous rights, and also labor unions in that case regarding fishing. How have these new actors affected the negotiation? Have they made a splash with a big voice? Are they tentative in any way? Is there feeling that they're newcomers and maybe should just sit and watch? How do the diplomats interact with these communities, and how has that dynamic been?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I'm very happy that you're asking it, because for me, in my role in the treaty, I feel that this is such an important part of it. I'm going to speak to the Canadian approach to this. I could, but I don't think it would be appropriate for me to speak of the US's approach. The US is there are differences in our constitutional and legal obligations, responsibilities, etc. So I'll stick to Canada, right? So what we did in Canada is, from the very, very, very onset, we have been working with the Indigenous nations, the First Nations, Indigenous nations in the basin, the Tunaha Nation, the Syilx, Okanagan, and the Secwepemc, to get them involved in what we do, and our relationship evolved over time, right? To the point where now I am very happy to say that, and my Indigenous colleagues would repeat it. I'm not speaking for them. They would repeat it. They are involved in every single thing that we do. every single decision of what we should do, what is good for us being the whole of Canada and then BC and then Indigenous nations, every single idea that we have in terms of positioning vis-a-vis the US, they are involved. We're not consulting with them. They're involved in the whole thing. And their voice is heard. I feel very confident, at least in my ears, they are heard at the same level as that of any other interlocutor, right? So we've engaged with them very significantly. They are present at the negotiation table with the US. They are formally called observers. I believe they are more than observers. I can tell you that they observe and give us their advice and piece of their mind when it's necessary, with only one caveat. When we sit down to negotiate with the US in order to have a coherent voice and to respect international law and everything, there's only one interlocutor, which is the federal government in me. But here's the thing. Sometimes we make presentations on some issues, and it's some of these issues, very important one, ecosystem being one. It's actually the Indigenous nations who are doing the work and making the presentation at the table, right? So we're very proud of that. It's difficult. It's difficult for everybody, right? I know that when it was first talked about that the Indigenous nations would sit at the table with us representing their nation, not as a token Indigenous person, a lot of people were nervous, saying you're creating a precedent. And one day in a meeting, I told that person, I said, well, I sure hope I am creating a precedent, because if I'm not, then nothing changes. And I felt very, very, very confident in that, because I only had to listen to what my prime minister has said publicly at the UN, etc., everywhere. And I know where I knew that I was on solid ground, and I was told also on solid ground. Minister Freeland was very much involved in our work and in including Indigenous nations in the equation. And I know we're doing the right thing. I know we're doing the right thing. I've always known, right? But I know that we have support for that.
Now, just one quick follow-up on that, because one of the key pieces, as you mentioned, was flood control. And I wonder if you could talk basically not so much as a negotiator, but as just an educator on this. How is climate change altering the significance of flood control? And I think as a layman, I would say, well, maybe it makes flooding less predictable because we're seeing snowfalls and other things changing, but maybe that's not a very informed opinion. In an era of climate change, to what extent is that a factor as we think about flood control and the potential impact going forward?
Well, since we're talking about British Columbia, you need only look at last summer and this fall. Okay, obviously you can see that, but maybe perhaps in a more oriented more towards what we're doing on the Columbia River. I said earlier that, a lot of the behavior, for lack of a better word, of the Columbia River hinges on snowfall and the timing of the melt and the freshet in the spring, right? Well, I'm not an expert, so I'm not going to try to throw figures at you, but we do know that we are beginning to see changes in terms of how much snow is falling, what kind of snow, how early. Do we only have one freshet, or do we have two, or the timing of these old things? So obviously, there is an impact. The problem we have, and that's okay to have problems, is it's very hard to say, because a lot of people often say, are you guys considering climate change in your work? And we say, yes, we are, but we don't have a crystal ball, right? So if the climate's going to change, by definition, it's hard to predict. So what we would like to have, and we've seen this in many, whether it's in the work of on other rivers or environmental work done in other aspects of the environment than water, is to make sure that whatever we agree upon as we modernize the treaty will be adaptable and flexible based on the change, right? You can't guess the change. You could give it a shot, but it's like gambling, right? But what you can do is say, let's make sure we provide the treaty with some flexibility that if things change in 15 years, we can address it in a certain way. So we are definitely thinking about that. Indigenous nations, I will not surprise you, are quite sensitive to that. Part of our team of negotiation and on the Canadian side, of course, Environment Canada is helping us, and it's certainly the same with the provincial representatives, right? So we're trying to take that into consideration, trying to make a treaty that will allow for flexibility.
So thanks for outlining kind of who's at the table, Consul General. I have a couple of questions about that. Well, one is, I think Chris and I would love to have another podcast on this subject with Indigenous leaders. So we'll talk to you offline about that, because I think it would be good to have their voices directly. And I appreciate very much they're at the table. So just to clarify, so you're the Consul General of Canada in Denver, and you're also one of the leading experts on this Columbia River Treaty. Are you still the lead negotiator? Like, do you wear two hats now, or just as a practical matter, have you handed it back? I know you're exercising diplomacy. You and I were together last summer in Montana. You gave a really powerful presentation on the Columbia River Treaty, but I just wonder, like, how does it fit in with your current portfolio? Are you doing both, or who's who in the zoo? And one of the reasons I ask about that also is I just have spent some time with Senator Cantwell and Senator Risch, and they're also two United States senators from the region, very interested in this and very engaged in how it goes. So just trying to, for our listeners, understand who's who and who's doing what, all of that sort of thing. Can you kind of walk us through that?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you're saying that, because in everything I've said so far, I have underplayed the role of British Columbia in that, right? Just to add to the history of things, once the treaty was negotiated with the US, Canada also signed an agreement with BC, clarifying, who does what and how and for what. Because obviously Canada is not in the business of building dams and managing water flows. This is a provincial responsibility. So obviously, what the treaty does, Canada signed the treaty, but BC implements the entire treaty and gets all the benefits, like whether it's the Canadian entitlement, whether it's the payment that was given originally for flood control. So obviously, in the negotiation, British Columbia is key, right? And when I, as a negotiator, need technical advice on these things, BC Hydro, which is involved in implementing the treaty, provides most of the expertise, on modeling and things like that. So British Columbia is key to this and provides a lot of expertise. And Kathy Eichenberger, who is their lead on the Columbia River Treaty, I am not shy to admit that she is the heart and soul of this whole process, right? And don't kid yourself, the Americans know that too. But it's fine, because Kathy and I work hand in hand. So to come back, I am the Consul General for Canada in Denver, but I am also still remaining the Consul General of the chief negotiator for the Columbia River Treaty. I wear two hats. Some people are maybe naive enough to accept two jobs. I just did.
I'm one of those people, and so is San. So we all have a few hats that we wear. Yeah.
but here's the thing. I am supported by a super duper team at Global Affairs in Ottawa. BC is there, BC Hydro, Indigenous Nations. So it works. It really works. And we're able to do both. I'm able to do both in what I hope is a successful way.
Thanks for outlining that. And just to follow up on one question. Now, most negotiators I know prefer to negotiate at the table, and they say we're not going to negotiate out. They used to say we're not going to negotiate in the newspapers. So maybe the modern corollary is we're not going to negotiate via podcast. So I understand that you're not here to negotiate, but you've heard the previous podcast we had on this from a U.S. perspective, and I wonder if you could just for the benefit of our listeners who aren't negotiators and who maybe don't follow this, or maybe they're not from the region, if there's one thing that the U.S. says about this Columbia River Treaty that drives you crazy from your point of view, what is it?
Yeah, you're right. I'm not negotiating publicly. I would never do so. You'll notice that I have not given a single comment on negotiations, and I won't. However, I can comment on things that are said publicly. Right. I mean, the first thing first, I'll say that this treaty is based on sharing equitably the benefits accrued from the treaty. That's the premise of the whole thing. And that's what we have to maintain in a modernized treaty. Right. So I hear sometimes people say, well, why should we keep paying Canada? You know, the dams have been paid for. So my answer to that is, okay, let me make you an analogy. You have an apartment building. I rent an apartment in your building. So when you stop paying your mortgage, do I stop paying you? What the US has paid for is not to build the dams. Canada did not enter a treaty to get money to build dams. We may have benefited from that money to do that, but the treaty was the US pays for occupying space behind dams, which flood an area, and it goes up and down and up and down, and it has an environmental impact. That's what the US is paid for. So if the dams have been paid for, okay, but you're not paying for the dams. You're paying for space behind the dam, and you're paying for Canada managing the flows so that the water accumulating behind the dams is released in a timing and a fashion that will maximize hydroelectric production in the US and minimize the flood risk in the US. So you're paying for space and management of water. You're not paying for that. There's another thing that I hear publicly often is the fact that the US is paying too much for the entitlement. And I say, well, the way the treaty works is Canada receives for the entitlement, the entitlement is the payment in electricity that Canada receives as a result of the US being able to produce more electricity. So if we manage the water in a fashion that the US can produce 100 units more electricity, the US gives us back 50 units, right? So when you say the US is paying too much, we say, wait a minute, you're paying us half of the potential electricity that you can produce due to our management. So in a way, you're giving us half a benefit. Now, sometimes the water is repurposed in the US for fish flows, for irrigation, for navigation, etc. But that's a choice that is made in the US, right? And the other thing in relation to the entitlement, I have heard publicly, I'm not talking about the table. People say Canada receives 300 to 350 million US dollars a year for the entitlement. And I'm like, whoa, I wish that's what we received. The average per year in Canada, and you can see the figure because BC usually sells that electricity back somewhere to the US. And it's in their public accounts. So you can see that on the internet. And so the benefit in Canada when we sell the electricity is it has averaged 128 million Canadian dollars per year. So 100 million US dollars. So it's nowhere near 300 to 350 million. So I often say that in public because I want to make sure that the people who listen to this get accurate figures. Because of course, if you think you're paying $350 million US for something, yeah, you could say it's expensive because in fact that's not what's happening. So these are a couple of things that I like when I have a chance to publicly talk about the Columbia River Treaty. These are a couple of misconceptions that I like to address when we do that.
Well, Sylvain, we definitely benefit from that explanation. Here on Canusa Street, we have a lot of interest in those details, and I think it was great to have them spelled out. But now I'll admit something. I am one of those terrible sports fans. Scotty is much better, but I tend to let the NHL season go, just kind of looking a little bit at the paper. And then when it's the playoffs, I start paying attention. Now, the negotiation, this round of the update for the treaty started in 2013. Partly, looking ahead to that 2024 date. Are we nearing the playoffs? Are we going to make it to 2024? Like, is this time to really sort of gear up our fandom and pay attention? Or is this just a slow boil? It's not going to have a sort of playoff finish. How would you describe our timing now as we get closer to 2024?
Well, the mere fact that we're closer to 2024 indicates that there is we have to take that into consideration, right? That's for sure. We had a 1.5 year hiatus. Whatever the reasons are, we had elections in the US, elections in Canada, blah, 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 whatever, right? So that certainly did not speed up the negotiations. We have re-engaged recently. We met in December and a couple of weeks ago, virtually, but it doesn't matter. We're doing work. And I can tell you that both sides are working towards a resolution. But what we're working towards now is I know it sounds sometimes it sounds like a lame explanation, but a lot of the data that we need on both sides to agree on a renewed treaty, some of that data is evergreen, and we're kind of developing it as we are negotiating. Some people say you could have done that years ago, maybe, but some of it, no. So that's one part of the reasons why it's sometimes we have to stop for a little moment, say, okay, you want to know this? We'll go back and produce it. But if it involves modeling, etc., you need engineers. Sometimes we have to hire people to give us a hand in coming up with these figures and data. So that's sometimes what slows down the process. I can tell you that in Canada, and I know it's the case in the US too, but I can't speak for them, we are determined to proactively, open-mindedly engage in a way that will produce a modernized instrument that will be beneficial for Canada, of course, we're Canada, but also will be mutually beneficial, because if it's not beneficial to the US, there will be no agreement. So we're trying to be as constructive as possible. And I think the two delegations, when we engage, the engagement is good, it's constructive, etc. But it's also a negotiation, right? So you have to keep that in mind.
So thanks for that. And, this will just be our last question. I think we're coming towards the end of our opportunity here to talk to you. And I'm really grateful. I want to ask you, we mentioned you're here with your hat on as Columbia River Treaty, but we mentioned that you also are the Consul General. And you and I mentioned we saw each other in Montana, but then a couple weeks later, last summer, we saw each other in South Dakota, and we were both talking to the Council of State Governments, and you had that other hat on, the Consul General. So I think I want to ask a wrap-up question that uses both your hats, which is, when you think about the whole panoply of Canada-U.S. issues, and we deal with them a lot here on Canusa Street, where does this one rank? How should people think about this? Because, when we were when our countries were renegotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement, it was pretty much number one, top of mind for like a year, right? I mean, that's a little bit of an oversimplification, but there are big things going on right now in the trade world and in the foreign policy world. So as you think about the broad Canada-U.S. relationship, from your point of view as Consul General, how do you rank order? How do you stack this one? I know it's important. I know it's crucial, but in the scheme of things, where do you place this?
The issue with the Columbia River is it has obviously a very clear geographic element attached to it, right? It concerns some states out west, of course, Washington State, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, because in Montana they have the Libby Dam, which is linked to the treaty. So it's an important issue because it's big. It involves protection against flooding. I mean, you're talking about people's livelihoods and even sometimes people's lives, and involves a significant sector. I always give as an example to put things in perspective. I do that mainly in Canada. To put things in perspective, the installed electricity capacity on the Columbia River is by and large twice the installed capacity in the whole network at James Bay. People don't realize that.
And James Bay being Hydro-Quebec going into New England and New York. Right. Okay.
And we have 5, 6, 7 dams there. I mean, just the Grand Coulee Dam, I think, I'm always careful when I give figures, but I think it has a capacity of 8,000 megawatt, right? Remember that once you become above 2,000 megawatt, you're a big dam, right? So there's a lot. So it's an important economic sector. It provides electricity to a big population in that area. Where does it stand? I mean, obviously, because of the geographic implications, it doesn't stand on top of the issues, but to the people in that area, I would say it's probably top 1 or 2 because of the implications. Overall in the US, it goes down a little bit, but sometimes it is raised in Washington. So
I was just going to say it's top 1 or 2 for a couple of very powerful United States senators, which means it goes top of the batting order in general because of the ranking member on foreign relations, which is Senator Risch, and because, of course, of the Washington delegation and their leadership. So Republicans and Democrats in leadership positions in big committees in Congress care about this. So, yeah, I hear you. Chris, I'm sorry. Over to you, my friend.
No. I was going to say, I'm convinced by you. I'm convinced by Sylvain. This is a big damn deal.
It's a big damn deal. With that, Consul General, we'll give you the last word, and we're just on the way out. We want to say thank you. Thank you for taking time to help us get a little bit smarter on this big damn deal. So over to you.
Yes, it was a pleasure to be here. I always appreciate the opportunity to constructively pass on messages regarding what we do. It's not always easy to do that. So thank you for giving me the opportunity, and happy to participate in the future on this or any other kind of issues where I could be of interest to you. So thanks.
Well, you live in a very interesting region, and it's particularly interesting in the winter when we can travel. So, Chris, we may have to have an in-person Canusa Street recording. I don't know, Aspen, Vail, Beaver Creek, something like that. Canusa Street hits the slopes. That's what I'm saying. Thanks very much, both of you. It's always great to be with you.
This podcast is brought to you by the Canadian American Business Council and the Wilson Center. If you like this episode, help others find our show and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.